Media today, we hear a lot about this idea of toxic masculinity, but in this video, we're going to talk about what healthy masculinity might look like. I actually don't really ascribe to the term toxic masculinity because I actually think that it creates more harm than it does good. I think in calling masculinity toxic, it actually just kind of deteriorates the idea of masculinity in and of itself. And so to understand this concept, what's really fundamental is that we have to understand that masculinity in and of itself is not toxic by any means. What the media is talking about and what many individuals are talking about when they're talking about toxic masculinity is horrendous and treacherous behaviors that men have perpetuated in the past. But I would argue that these expressions were not expressions of masculinity, but rather expressions of misused power, misused sexuality, in some cases evil. And so I actually don't ascribe to the idea that masculinity in and of itself is toxic. And I hope to shift the narrative to move away from this idea, because I think that masculinity is actually a very beautiful energy when encompassed by and wielded by those who actually can use it in a healthy way. And so when we're talking here about healthy masculinity versus toxic masculinity, I want to change the narrative to understanding that toxic masculinity could actually be reworded as wounded masculinity or a hurt man. The cliche or the simple phrase, hurt people hurt people. Well, this is true in this case as well, that typically if a man were to enact a horrendous act, such as hurting another individual, usually they actually were really hurting themselves in some way. And this is by no means an argument to say that, there are horrendous acts that don't need to be compensated for by our justice system. But what this is to say is that understanding that somebody enacts something like rape or violence or domination only from a place of deep rooted pain, and that pain typically comes from, traumatic events in early childhood upbringing. And so from this lens, we can start understanding that what we need in this world is actually less of a shunning towards men, but actually more compassion and kindness towards especially boys. And then also as men start maturing, a lot of men today, at least from my observation, especially young men, are feeling lost and like they don't have a place in the world. And, a lot of younger men are starting to turn towards figures of unhealthy masculinity that they see in the media, because our media actually perpetuates and sort of rewards narcissistic ideals. And so toxic masculinity is kind of thrown around in our culture, sort of like the epitome of what some young boys see as having a sense of power in the world. And so this idea of power has been misplaced. The idea of power, when used in an unhealthy way, is this idea to dominate other people. And so what we're talking about here with healthy masculinity is the shift of moving from domination to collaboration, from being strictly competitive to also seeing cooperation. This isn't to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Of course, there's value in having competition in healthy ways, but recognizing that competition is used to ultimately be a sense of cooperation, not as a sense of putting another person down, right? Iron sharpens iron. So it's the same idea that, in competitive circles, that being competitive with each other really can help to make someone better. I see this all the time in jiu-jitsu, right? If I'm to hold back a little bit in jiu-jitsu with somebody who's, equal level as me, they're not going to get as much out of that. They're not going to be able to receive the same level of lessons if I were to be going with my competitive nature against them as well. And so from that place, we can start developing greater skills. Whereas if I hold back in some way, that's not cooperative. That's actually going to be, kind of antithetical to cooperative. It's not going to help anybody. So seeing that there is a healthy form of competition, but ultimately it's moving from a place of competition into cooperation. And so I have a definition here of healthy masculinity that I want to play with. And I'll kind of break it down bit by bit as well as we go along. So I actually had ChatGPT, and I've been working with ChatGPT for a bit. I actually prompted it to kind of develop this message that I think really sort of resonates with the voice that we're attempting to articulate here. And so healthy masculinity is the embodiment of authentic strength, where power is tempered by compassion, discipline is aligned with integrity, and vulnerability is embraced as a sign of courage rather than weakness. And so the definition actually goes a little bit longer, but I do want to kind of break down each one of these parts right here. So masculinity is an embodiment of authentic strength. And so when we talk about authentic strength, what that means is that we're not coming from a place of strength, once again, as a place of dominating over other people, because that actually comes from a place of insecurity. in oneself. If I need to put others down in order to feel better, ultimately that means that I carry inside of me some sense of shame. Shame can be experienced as that oscillation of feeling better than or less than other people, this constant oscillation between, being better than somebody or being less than somebody. And ultimately what shame does is it doesn't want us to be human. It doesn't want us to have limitations or imperfections. And Nietzsche actually described that shame is kind of like the starting place for spirituality, of recognizing that we are human and that we aren't necessarily, that we do have limitations, that we aren't God in the sense of being omnipotent. And so it's to recognize where our limitations lie, but also to recognize where they don't lie as well. And what trauma can do is kind of place those limitations on ourselves in places where they don't need to be. And it can also create this idea that we don't have limitations either, right? It's that same oscillation between better than or less than. It kind of goes to one extreme or the other, and it can oscillate back and forth between the two. And so essentially what we're talking about here is that in order to embody some kind of authentic masculinity, there does need to be some kind of a spiritual connection. And I mean the spiritual connection in the sense of just having some kind of connection to recognizing that there's something greater in the universe than oneself. This could be a sense of community. It could be a sense of purpose. It could be a higher power. It could be creative intelligence. It could be some sort of religious functioning. The sort of variability is endless here, but ultimately what this is it's an orientation of one's values in the world around them, and being able to stand up for those values. And so healthy masculinity as the embodiment of authentic strength ultimately means being who we are, having the courage to be who we are. And that kind of leads into one of these other points, that vulnerability is embraced as a sign of courage rather than weakness. And so ultimately being who we are means showing up as who we are and showing up fully, being able to express our emotions, being able to express the wide range of emotions in a way that's healthy, being able to express anger without necessarily expressing violence, the same way that, Gandhi would talk about that he wanted the British to leave, but he wanted them to leave as friends, right? And so being able to stand up for what you want, but also not hurting others in the same way. And so understanding that, there's a wide range here of flexibility of being able to express and be with different emotions, but doing so in a way that actually cultivates more peace, love, and compassion in the world, as opposed to just being a detriment to oneself and creating suffering in those around one. This other idea here, when power is tempered by compassion. So recognizing that, of course, power exists. Of course, hierarchies exist. It'd be silly to say that they didn't exist, but also recognizing that, with one sense of power, this isn't, once again, a place to start dominating or controlling others, but to recognize the compassion in oneself. True leadership that I've seen in organizations is not one leader kind of, pointing the way and then all the other people following behind that person. What I see as true leadership is falling behind every single other person and helping them go along the way with the leader, making sure that each person is taken care of and doing well. I think that true leadership really is kind of that embodiment of that king energy or that king archetype of being able to check in on people and make sure that they're doing okay. And true compassion. Compassion is a word, when broken down, means com, meaning with, and passion, meaning emotion. So really what we're talking about here is to be with somebody else's emotions, to be able to slow down and to be with somebody and to connect and to empathize and to attune to another person and to make sure that they're doing okay. And to me, that's a true sense of power then when one can take time out of their day to really sit with somebody and be with somebody and check in on them. This other one, discipline, is aligned with integrity. I really do like the idea of discipline. I consider myself a very disciplined individual. Every single day I have my morning routine, and I think that it's really important that one's morning routine does sort of orient themselves towards their life's vision, towards their purpose, or towards their calling. And if you haven't discovered that yet, I actually just created a video if you want to check that out about discovering your calling. But essentially, it's important to start having a little bit of intentionality to one's life and to recognize that this life may be the only life we get to live, or maybe not, but that we're here right now embodied in this current present moment. And if we want to have a fulfilled life, it really does involve being able to bear suffering in some sort of a sense, moving towards a greater vision for oneself and for others in a communal sense as well. And so having discipline, having habits and skills and daily routines to orient oneself of adding these little drops of water towards one vision each and every day. So that discipline leading towards something towards a vision or towards one's dream is really kind of the thought process here. So the second part of this definition is masculinity is about facing one's shadow, integrating all parts of the self, and showing up in the world as a whole person, grounded, resilient, and deeply connected to others. Healthy masculinity moves away from domination towards collaboration, not as a rejection of masculinity, but as an expansion of what it can mean. And so ultimately here, what we're talking about is, once again, tapping into the shadow, tapping into these uncovered emotions inside of oneself. I think that I've grown up in a society, especially in our feminist culture, not to take away any advancements that women have made or that femininity have made. We need that, and we need to continue that, and women are doing an incredible job of that. And at the same time, I do see that men are falling behind. For the first time, there are less men today in higher education than there have been in any previous generation. So we've taken a step back that way, which is pretty wild. I do think that men are kind of lost in today's world and really seeking meaning or seeking something as we've been stripped away from traditional masculine roles, which is okay, because now we get to actually explore what masculinity may be just beyond a social construct. And I really do think it is up to each and every man in and of themselves to ultimately discover what that means for them. What does it mean to be a man? Understanding that being a man has little to nothing to do with sexual orientation. Being a man can be, strong in different kinds of ways, being receptive as well as being an instigator, or different kinds of energies that way. However, ultimately what we're talking about here is how can a man show up fully as themselves in the world around them, a protector of themselves, of people around them, of children, of women, of other men. How can a man help show other men the way? How can a man ultimately help to shepherd people towards a greater sense of love and peace and compassion? And so ultimately, I think that when we look towards some of the greater masters, such as Jesus Christ or Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, or Mahatma Gandhi, we can recognize that these men were really the embodiment of healthy masculinity, of love, of compassion, of being with other people, of strength, of authentic strength. And so we can kind of look to these role models and see the qualities that they have and try to foster that for ourselves in our own lives, not to necessarily replicate or have an entire similar existence to they had, but to embody and to have our own sense of Christhood in our lives, to have our own sense of Buddha nature in our lives, and to take that into everything that we do. And ultimately, I do think that that is the path of healthy masculinity. So with that, thank you so much for tuning in. If you'd like to discuss this any further with me or work with me one-on-one, I am currently taking on clients. You can click the link down below. I primarily work with men. Also, if you wouldn't mind liking and subscribing, it would help this video to get into YouTube's algorithm. And if you're on Spotify, if you wouldn't mind rating this podcast as well. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll catch you in the next one. Take care.